Let's take a look at how we can create a simple dashboard using an Excel dataset. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to immediately come into a dataset that is cleaned. A lot of this class time we've spent understanding the data, using formulas, creating new analytics to clean the data and get a dataset that looks like what we have on the screen here. And this is our property tax dataset. So I'm going to now select my data using my hotkeys, Command, Shift, right arrow, down arrow, and I'm going to create a pivot table. So I am immediately jumping right into the pivot table environment. So let's imagine that I want a report that shows by neighborhood. I want to have the land assessment, the building assessment, total assessment, let's say also sale price, tax evaluation, and assessment sales ratio. Okay, so just right there, I'm getting all this data summarized by neighborhood, and I also want to come in here and let's imagine that I want averages for some of these. So, and finally what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to keep this as a count, because what I want to do is I want to show the number of properties that I'm evaluating and that also fall into this neighborhood. And I actually am realizing I want this to be right next to the neighborhood name. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this up and I'll put it up at the top here. And now what I have is going from left to right. I have a count of the properties. And then I can go across and just look at the assessment details, the sale price details, and the assessment sales ratio. Now I also want to create some formatting because I know that an end user is not going to be able to make best use out of these numbers. These are very large, they have too many decimals, and I don't have any dollar signs. So let me go ahead and just quickly format, get rid of those decimal points, and I'm also going to make this a percentage, and I do want 2 decimal precision for this. Finally, I'm going to update my column headers, and I can name these whatever I want. I actually like most of these as is. Finally, I'm going to wrap text my column headers. Okay, so now I have a pretty good looking table, and now what I want to be able to do is I want to give the user the ability to manipulate this pivot table without having to go in and actually change the pivot table options. I don't want the end user to see this pivot table report writer. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use something called the slicer. And the pivot table analyze has got some interesting, so with the slicer what I can do is I can choose different filters. Now let's imagine that I want to choose tax block, I want to choose property class name, and I also want to choose the recorded date. Okay, and these are the various, and those are the fields that I want to slice by. I'm going to choose OK, and I get these 3 additional features that show up on my page, and I'm just going to drag and drop them. It's pretty easy here. What this basically does is it allows me to now drill into my pivot based on whatever I select over here. So watch how when I click commercial. So when I clicked commercial, my pivot table updated and my other slicer options also updated. Now this is looking pretty good. I like how I have this ability to drill in, but I'm noticing something, which is that I want to be able to, when I, for instance, click on church and charitable, I want to be able to access the property name. So let me go in and actually pull in more slicing data. And I'm going to come in and pull property location. And what that gives me the ability to do is immediately see, when I highlight church and charitable, the actual address, which is 113 Montgomery. So the slicer gives us the ability to drill into more detail than might be available in the pivot. Other thing I'm noticing is in the slicer options that I had a timeline. So let me check that out. What's the timeline? And I see I get an option to choose recorded date. Here, what it's doing is it's giving me a different way to view into my recorded date field. I can actually customize the way that this timeline slicer looks. For instance, I can choose to group my data by quarters. I can also choose to group it by years, or I can keep it by months. Let's imagine that I want all the months to be visible, meaning I don't want to have to scroll back and forth. So again, a little bit of formatting here. I'm going to, and I'm looking at this, and I think what I want to do is, I think I want to have everything centered. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come across to here. I'm going to use the grid lines here as sort of a guide. I'm going to use the fact that I've got this very handy grid sheet, and I'm going to make it all even, and I'm going to try and center my filters above, and I'm going to select my entire pivot table, do Command X, and now I have a little bit more of a center view. I'm also going to come in here, I'm going to merge, I'm going to give a little bit of an underline, and I'm going to move this table over one more. Okay, and now I have a bit more of a centered view here. And there we go. Okay, so this is the start of my dashboard. By the way, I'm noticing here I have numbers that are missing. I'm going to drag that across. Okay, so this looks good. So this is the final look and feel that I want. Now I want to put a title on here, and I also want to put some margins. I want to make this look almost like a web page. And here's how we would do that. I'm going to insert a couple rows at the top and insert a couple of columns on the left. I'm creating a margin for myself. I'm going to select the rightmost column. I'm going to make that this gray. I'm actually going to make that a little bit darker. I'm going to do the same thing at the top, and I'm also going to wrap it on the right, going all the way off to the left, and I'm also going to do it at the bottom, going all the way down to the bottom. Next, I'm going to give this a title. I'm going to make this a nice, big, bold, and I'll give a subheader of Fall 2023, and I'll make that italicized. Now, we're still not there because I'm noticing that I am not centered. I've got 2 columns over here and only 1 column over here. Let me go ahead and delete this column. And now I'm a little bit more centered and this looks good. I have a couple final steps. I'm going to do some final adjustments with my view. I don't want my end user to see the grid lines, so I'm going to take away the grid lines. Look at how there's a nice, neat view now. There's no grid line. In addition to putting on the borders, I also want to be able to remove my headers and my rows, because what I want to do is I want someone coming into this worksheet and not seeing the rows or column headers. Right now, what I want you to realize is that this is something that you could use if you were answering questions quickly. You could use this in addition to your other pivot skills to answer questions from your reporter colleague. If we wanted to provide a dashboard like this to a client, what we would want to do is we would want to have the client test it out. We want to get feedback. There would be lots of feedback that a client might give us that we might not realize. For instance, they might say, well, I don't really need block, or I want property class name, but I want another filter as well. And the list would go on. And that would be a whole separate sort of stream of work. But this gives you an idea of one way that we can build upon our pivot table work. It's very important to understand that this exercise is not possible unless and until we've done all the skills you've learned in the class thus far, which is understanding our data types, understanding how to clean the data, how to organize the data, how to create pivot tables, and so on. Okay? This is a fun way to kind of bring it all together to show how we can create something pretty cool for an end user, even if that end user is ourselves. Thanks.